Sister Packer, in the past several years, I've had the opportunity to associate with your husband and talk about art a lot. And I think a lot of people don't realize his interests in art and his enjoyment in creating as well as appreciating the arts. And he doesn't like to talk about his own work. I already know that. And so we kind of prevailed upon you to share a few of the things that he's done to let folks see the kind of things he likes to do. Tell us a little bit about his artwork.
Well, I know his mother mentioned to me that he had a great interest in art very, very early. He would lay on his tummy on their linoleum floor. Dad Packer would bring home newsprint from the news journal. He would stretch out there and do his little thing. This has been a long time interest. He came to Earth with this interest.
He doesn't just arbitrarily do pictures. They almost always relate to your family and things that are important to him. There's one we're standing in front of. Tell us a little bit about this painting, which is one of my favorites.
This happens to be a thatched cottage that was in Brigham City. It's my great-great-grandparents, Swin Lindahl. I think maybe in Sweden he only knew how to make a thatched cottage. It burned down, I think, in the 30s and 1930s, so that it was there for a long time.
But you have a beautiful painting of it.
Yes.
And there are a number of paintings, and we'll walk around and look at a few things, but I think this might be one of my favorite things that he does. I love Noah's Ark.
This is a favorite thing with our grandchildren, and he made it specifically for them. They can look at it and enjoy it, but they also can handle it and get their little chair and kneel up and play with these animals. And it has an interesting feature that we can store all of these animals in Noah's Ark.
How fun. Well, you've actually got a lot of pieces of beautiful artwork that decorate your home,
yes.
Both in sculpture and painting. And I'd like to take a few minutes and kind of look at the artwork that Elder Packer does. There you are. We're going to go on an art tour of your house.
Not we, you. She's the tour guide in the family.
Okay, that's fair. We'll let her talk about your work.
Well, this was inspired. One day President Packer was going down in the woods in the fall, and we raised a number of birds, pheasants and peacocks, and he observed this setting with the fall leaves, and he thought, this would enhance our home.
Tell me about the presidents.
Those are near Willard, Box Elder County, and there are 3 peaks, and in early days they called them the presidency, meaning the presidency of the church.
And then there's this beautiful fireplace as well that
yes.
he carved, right?
We were married in 1947, and we have pioneer heritage, and so I think this depicts not only the church's heritage, but our personal heritage.
Now, the bird pieces have been his passion for a long time.
Oh, yes. Yes, I think so.
And they are exquisite.
Yes, I like this chickadee. It's so natural. This blue jay is very striking in the autumn leaves. One of his favorite colors is blue, of course.
They're very accurately carved.
Oh, yes, they are proportionate, and also he makes the foliage, which is out of copper.
Oh my goodness, and hand-painted. I mean, it's all done from
everything
scratch.
Yes.
The newest addition to your home that I've seen is the beautiful gallery of pheasants. Now, he once told me that the bird carving was good for him because that's how he solved his problems. So it's not just doing it for art.
That's right.
Gives him some thinking time, doesn't it?
Yeah, keeps his hands busy and his mind's free to kind of think and ponder.
The Mormon Festival of Arts has been in existence for a few years, and we have tried very hard to encourage the arts within the church, and as we share our talents with those within and without the church. And it's always exciting for us to be able to talk to one of the brethren and get a feeling about how you view art. Maybe to start, let's talk about just the importance of the arts in the church. It seems to me it's always been a factor in the development of the church from the earliest days.
I haven't attended the Festival of Arts. I've heard a good deal about it.
Uh-huh.
I don't know whether you knew that in Salt Lake City in the early days, in about 1850, they organized the Polysophical Society.
Huh.
Poly means many, sophical. The sophists were supposedly interested in the art of living fully. And so they met twice a month at the home of Lorenzo Snow, who's kind of the center of it. And all of the brethren belonged to it, and it was an early Mormon festival of the arts. Huh. Because there they had poetry and reading and literature, everything showed works of art and whatever. It was fairly well organized. They had a master of ceremonies, and he would introduce the participants. And then they had a messenger, a boy. There was no introduction to those who would perform, except he would ring a little bell and hand a note to the boy. He'd take it to the next one to participate, say Eliza or Snow, and she would come forward and read one of her poems. Some of her finest were introduced first in that Polysophical Society. They had some rules, too, that they could, nothing that was boisterous or unseemly. And then they had another rule that I wish applied across the board in the church, and that is that no one was to take more than 15 minutes in their presentation.
Okay.
But that was to bring culture and broaden the interest of saints in those days. Brigham Young was very interested in it. But really, that was the beginning of the Mutual Improvement Association. That grew out of that. Later, when Lorenzo Snow was sent to Brigham City, the only true city, and he went there and found the people were still living in dugouts, and they needed to be lifted up. Well, the way you lift people is with the arts, with music and art and literature, with fine things. And so he built a home on Main Street, finest home in town, and a stage at one end, and started holding meetings of the Polysophical Society. And in the winter nights, they would go there for a drama or for music of all kinds and literature and art. And that's something of the beginning. So this Mormon Festival of Arts is carrying on a tradition, an important tradition in the church. Because Lorenzo Snow was the first stake president in Brigham City, and he had established the Polysophical Society there, he's part of our family tradition, and that's why we have this painting that you painted, Jim, and it's one of the favorite pieces we have in our home.
The artists, the painters who were sent to Paris to prepare for doing art for the church, did they come out of this Polysophical Society?
They came a little later, but there's a lesson in that, because the temple was underway, and it was about to the point where they were going to do the interiors and the appointments, and so they called, to begin with, 4 brethren, and they sent them to Paris to study painting in order to do the interior of painting. And I thought that that's a lesson, because we have members in the church who are in the field of the arts who have an idea that inspiration will come, and I have talent, and that's all I need. Uh-huh. Well, they had inspiration, and they had all the talent, but they needed to be trained. They needed to do the work, to learn the fundamentals, the basics, in order that they could produce works of art, particularly in the temple, that would be creditable. That's something that's a little hard to learn. The Lord said something to one of the early men who was assisting Joseph Smith, to Oliver Cowdery. Said, you thought you could just sit there and soak it in, and that isn't the way it works.
That was the ninth section of the Doctrine and Covenants, where he's wanting to translate the Book of Mormon.
And I think those who are interested in art and literature and drama, and now we move into photography, great photography, and art and photography, and motion picture and dance, that there are fundamentals that apply. You have to earn it.
The pattern that the Lord gives Oliver to be able to do translation, to figure it out, think it through, do the work first, you feel is an important part of the arts as well. Because very often as a teacher, I'm confronted with a student who is a little upset because they say, I prayed before I did this painting, and you don't think it's a great painting, and I think the Spirit gave it to me, and I'm saying, gee, you just don't know how to draw yet. You know?
Prayer without works is dead.
Well,
Alone.
Okay.
There is a law irrevocably decreed in heaven before the foundation of the earth, upon which all blessings are predicated. And when we receive a blessing, it's by obedience to the laws. And there are laws underpinning all of the things you're talking about in the Mormon Festival of Art. Obey the law, get the blessing. And people outside of the church, some rascal, reprobate people, who obey that part of the law that relates to developing their talents and so on, produce great works of art. The inspiration that comes as it relates to art and science comes after people have earned it. And that's why it's important to have training.
Do you think that in the church, because we have access, if I can use that word, to inspiration, we understand how it works, do you think we don't work hard enough? Do you think are you intimating that that's maybe why we use outside talent so much when we're doing productions for the church, or sometimes films or art for our visitor centers? We use non-LDS people. Is that because we're not working hard enough within the church?
Oh, partly, and there's another kind of a mentality that we have. I remember once the brethren wanted to have a picture of Christ. They thought that we ought to have one produced by a member of the church, and I was kind of teamed up with Mark Peterson. It was a very interesting thing to watch, because using members of the church, because they had the right to inspiration by their own measurement, they kept telling the brethren what they wanted. This is what you really want. And I can remember finally Mark said, in I think some exasperation, he said, you'd think that they would think that we know a little about what he looked like. You look at the general authorities, and we're kind of a collection from everywhere. I'm a retreaded school teacher, and Brother Perry's a businessman, and Brother Oakes is an attorney, and they suppose that that we're kind of out of our field when we talk about these things. And it's a little difficult if Latter-day Saint artists would treat the church, I think, like they would a customer. And as a customer's right, we'll do what you want.
I hear what you're saying about the client relationship, and I certainly think that when I do something for the church, I'm listening. At least I hope I can. That's part of my prayers, that I can be a good listener and get what's needed. But I have to admit, there's sometimes working by committee that's pretty frustrating, because everybody feels they need to justify their existence by making a change in your work.
I don't know anything about committees.
Yeah, well, we'll
I know
talk
the
about
problem.
it. We'll talk.
You know the story of the camel.
That's right, and that can be very frustrating for artists, because we are trying to do the best we can, and we're trying to listen, but sometimes everybody has an opinion on it, and we end up with too many camels. Should we be concerned that there, or simply aware that there are two different kinds of art? There's a personal art and there's a public art.
If you take music, if it's going to go in the temple, or if it's going to be for church use, it ought to be appropriate. And I'm often in an interesting position, because there are some things that don't go together, and it has to be appropriate. For instance, some years ago they produced a film on the First Vision. Beautifully done. It was for the seminaries. And I looked at it, came kind of through the regular correlation process, and when I looked at it, I thought it was well done, except for the music. And the music didn't fit. And they said, well, what's wrong with it? It's beautiful. It was nice music. It was kind of wasn't soft rock, wasn't hard rock. And they said, this will appeal to the young people. And I said, I know, but you don't want to put the first vision, you don't want to dress the first vision in Levi's. Well, that disturbed him, and on a number of occasions where you're trying to say that the two things don't fit together, and so the conclusion is you don't like that you're against that style of art or that style of architecture, that style of music, when all it is to have it appropriate. For instance, I remember once that someone was kind of interested in having a brass band play in a sacrament meeting. Well, that kind of didn't get done. Well, that means you don't like band music. I think John Philip Sousa is inspiring. Ever since I could march to that in the military, that's great. But it doesn't fit together in a sacrament meeting. Also, as much as I love, say, the sacramental hymns, I think they'd really be out of place in a carnival or a circus. Over the years, I once went down to BYU to speak. This was early on, and they'd had some athletic achievements, and they wanted to honor them in this devotional assembly. So they kind of had the pep band. Well, I had a very sacred subject, and I didn't know what to say when I got up. I didn't know how to say it. I didn't know how to change that atmosphere. Well, musicians can do that, and artists can do that, and filmmakers can do that, and dancers can do that. They can create an atmosphere, and sometimes I've been in meetings where when someone's played music and I stood up to speak, I felt like an intruder because they had opened the windows of heaven and the Spirit was there.
Then, as the individual artist in whatever discipline approaches their work, how do they find that in their personal work? Because I have a hard time, I don't want to separate completely, compartmentalize what I do for the church or for my religion or for my soul from what I do out there. I'm trying to have what I do outside the church be uplifting and appropriate for me and for what I represent as much as anything. How do we find that?
Well, the beauty is you can do anything you want. The mission of your Festival of Arts relates to the article of faith. Everything that is lovely or praiseworthy of good report, we seek after these things. So the marvelous thing that members of the church in the arts can do what they want. They can produce symphonic music, and or they can produce ballads or religious music or whatever, but they ought to do it well, and they have the right to do it with inspiration. And one thing I have said more times than a few is that we live far below our privileges. Members of the church live far below our privileges as far as inspiration is concerned.
So you're indicating to me that inspiration, what I'm hearing you say, is not reserved for the church project.
No.
The temple film, the visitor center art. We have a right to inspiration in everything we do.
If you're a composer and composing background music for a film or a video or something, or to sell on in the music market. We talk about the gift of the Holy Ghost and the right to inspiration. We tell a doctor he has the right to inspiration as he moves forward. Why shouldn't those who are producing things that are lovely and praiseworthy of good report? One of the problems is that things are degrading, and the standards and what the world wants, we can sell ourselves.
Okay. Well, then that brings me to another point, and that's where do you see the trends going, and how do we deal with what's happening that way?
As the generations go on, we will become differenter and differenter from the mainstream.
More peculiar.
More peculiar. That's a great statement, that we are a peculiar people. That because we can't do what the world expects. And you look at music. There's a dissonance, an arrhythmia to it, and the standards are amoral, if not immoral. You see it in drama. You see no holds barred profanity, pulling down all the barriers. And there are laws, and there are barriers. There's one statement in the Doctrine and Covenants, the 124th section, that you mentioned temples a few minutes ago. We're building a lot of temples. And small temples. And temples invite art, painting, for instance. And temples invite music as well. And it ought to be appropriate. And there's a little lesson in the 124th section. And let me read it to you. And you've read the 124th section, haven't you?
I believe I have, yes.
It's, I was going to quote it, and you wouldn't know the difference if I misquoted it, but I better read
You
it.
never know.
You never know. This is very interesting. In the very early days, and send ye swift messengers, yea, chosen messengers, and say unto them, come ye with all your gold and your silver and your precious stones, and all your antiquities, and those who have knowledge of antiquities, that will come, may come, and bring the boxwood and the fir tree and the pine trees together with all the precious trees of the earth, and with iron, with copper and brass, and with zinc, and with all your precious things of the earth, and build a house unto my name, for the Most High to dwell therein. And then the next verse talks about the supernal sacredness of what they were about. For there is not a place found on the earth that he may come to restore again that which was lost unto you, or which he hath taken away, even the fullness of the priesthood. So in preparation for the restoration, the Lord invited them to bring all of that together, but your antiquities and those who have knowledge of antiquities, and I think that we have a tendency to tear down anything that's old and want to replace it with something that is sterile, that has no feeling to it, that has no color to it, and there's a lesson in that.
Now, President, you've talked about being positive, hearing the voice of inspiration of the 13th article of faith. For the sake of reality, of how things are, to not be Pollyannish or avoid the real issues in society today, even as we as LDS people have to deal with them. Sometimes filmmakers, artists, writers use the language of the world, use an immoral situation to teach a moral lesson. How do we talk about Sodom if we don't go through the city? How do you feel about using that, if the end, using those means to get to the positive end?
I think those in the creative arts who've been given talent, which is a gift, they didn't earn it, they have it, they can develop it or ignore it. But I think in the church we have a great responsibility to deal with what ought to be as compared to what is. If you stay on the level of what is and never rise to what ought to be. Take filmmaking, for instance. Tremendous power when you get an audience that's sitting there and someone has made a film that has inspiration, and you touch the emotions, then you're touching into the spirit. And we can do that. And we can do it and preserve it. They can put it on film and it can be preserved for generations. And it takes someone with inspiration, sensitivity to do that. I think a lot of it has to do with simplicity. It's the simple things, the basic things, and a lot of people who are well trained. On the other hand, you know, we talked about people having inspiration and talent and well trained. You get a lot of people that are giants insofar as their competency and training are concerned, but they're midgets on inspiration and so on. That they have contempt for the simple things, for the simple music, the simple melodies, the quiet music.
You feel that it's more important for an artist in any discipline to turn himself inward and create works for the church, or to turn outward and use their talents to present things to the world out there?
I think you ought to be able to do both. And in a way, it's the same thing if they keep the standards. If their standards are high.
Sometimes when we go out, we draw a fine line between being in the world and of the world, and that's difficult for a lot of us. Elder Ballard in the conference talked about separating that couplet into being in the world and do be in the world and be part of it and produce and contribute, but don't be of the world, don't compromise. At the same time, I don't want to pitch my tent towards Sodom. I worry about that a little bit.
Well, I worry about your doing it and the other artists doing that. Brother Ballard was just really basing that idea on what the Lord said when he prayed for his apostles and the members, praying for all of us. He said, I pray not that thou should take them out of the world, but thou should keep them to sin. We have to live in the world, but we don't have to live like the world. We can keep our standards, and they ought to be high standards. And then we have an extra inspiration. And I think it makes up for lack of talent, sometimes even for lack of training. If I have the Lord inbound when you do what I say. When you do not what I say, you have no promise.
The reason I've pursued this idea of facing in or facing out is that sometimes it's safer to work inside the church, to just sort of cocoon yourself and do work for the church magazines or do work for, write hymns. But the challenge of going out there and becoming credible in the real world and then writing great music is a hard thing to do, and I know we as artists worry a lot about, should we be trying to do that? Should we be trying to establish our credentials in the real world so that they will take our contributions, which we think have merit, seriously?
Well, of course we have to try, and we have to try to raise the standards, and we have to make our stand. And an actor, for instance, and we've had great examples of that, who just looked at a director and said, well, I'm not prepared to do that. I'm just not prepared to do that. You can get that impression some other way. You don't have to be that graphic. You can, and a talented director can. A talented director can show all that's needed to know. They used to do it well. You knew what went on without. And when you see a member of the church that sells themselves, I think of the proverb, like a jewel of gold in the snout of a swine is a fair lady who's without discretion. And you don't have to. We ought to be the standard raisers. Part of the solution, not part of the problem.
In a talk you gave at some point in your career, and I've read it in a manual, you talked about 4 Ps. You talked about policies, procedures, programs, and principles, and you said in that, and I've used it and I've enjoyed it a lot, that the policies, procedures, and programs are all flexible. And you were talking about things going on within the church. But I found a real parallel to that with the arts, that each artist is working in a different medium, he's got a different thing to say, he's expressing in a different form, but the constant there are the principles. Is that fair?
Yes.
And what are the principles that we all should base our work on?
Well, elementary common decency and reverence and integrity and just that. That is, you get a talented painter who paints pornographic paintings. That's a terrible prostitution when his talent could be used for what ought to be. And if he does it well, he can do it for the world and sell to them, and they'll buy it. Generally, people are good. Generally, there's a market for things that are of quality, and the church is getting bigger, but a great artist in the church can't sell all he makes to the church. Shouldn't have to. And he should be able to go out and compete, and we have them that do.
What do you see in the future? What do you see as possibilities?
President Kimball gave a talk years ago called A Style of Our Own. And everything moves to it's erratic and intemperate and shabby, and you don't see the formality that you used to, and we're all slouchy. And that's true of the arts. And I think members of the church set a standard in their clothing. Modesty. Modesty is a tremendous virtue. And if the day comes when they say, well, if you do this, I'll buy it. If you don't, I won't, then members of the church have to be prepared to say, no sale. I work for a higher standard.
Sometimes you give me the impression you don't quite trust creative people. They're a little scary.
Oh, we have to trust them. We have to trust them. They have the talent and the ability to produce.
Do you still think that art makes a difference, that the arts are important to us as human beings on this earth?
Well, just erase them. And what would you have?
Well, I think it gets pretty boring, but I'm an artist.
Boring, it would be intolerable, insufferable. That, no, the music, the literature, that's to delight the mind and that give variety to our lives and invoke the feelings. You can look at a painting and be inspired, spiritually inspired. You can hear music, and if our members can do that, why then they've done great good.
I've often felt in church meetings in appropriate locations that music is the best way to praise the Lord. I find myself thinking that if I was in the presence of the Lord, music would be the way to get the feelings of my soul across to Him. And I find myself moved that way as well.
Well, you speak for all of us. Music is the language of inspiration if it's appropriate music.
Where do our talents come from? Do you think we bring them with us? Do you think there's something within us that's part of this eternal individual?
There's something in the Book of Mormon that talks about gifts, given to each man severally as he will. I've never been sure as to whether that he will meant us or the Lord, but there are gifts of the Spirit. I read that once and thought, if those are gifts and we can claim them, I know the one I want to claim. And that is the gift to teach by the Spirit. And but they are gifts because to one is given this and to another is given that, and the Scripture outlines them. And it's some it's physiological. They have vocal cords that make it possible for them to sing, or they have the coordination and the feeling and the knowledge that they can play musical instruments, and a lot of that goes undeveloped, and yet think of the brother and sister somebody, and you can pick them out in every town that sing at all the funerals. Now that's giving of their gifts. There are members across that live out their lives in obscurity, and they end up the valedictorians in mortality. I know we look at those that are great and are well paid and highly acclaimed, that when you get across the veil and we know a little about what's there, the real valedictorians in mortality will be just what the prophet said, a man and a woman living together in love and raising a family under ordinary circumstances, doing the best they can with what they've got, wondering why someone else had the prominence and the good fortune, and ending up finding out that they had it all. Just like in Maeterlinck's Bluebird. Looking for the bluebird all over and coming back, and the little gray bird had turned blue.
I think that's a wonderful message for the women of the church. We've talked a lot about balance and appropriateness and training and using the inspiration. I know there are a lot of women in the church who are young women, excited, full of talent, full of gifts that they want to express artistically. And at the same time, they have great desires to have families and raise them. And there seems to be a lot of conflict there, and sometimes frustration that they can't kind of be the artistic folks they want to be. What would you say to the women of the church?
You're trying to get me in trouble.
I might.
There's a time for everything. And in family history, for instance, and I think there's a parallel, we don't press a young mother with little children to go to the temple once a month. In the home, she can fulfill that by keeping the scrapbook of the youngster, keeping their report cards and their achievement and their certificates and so on. And when you talk about creation, is there anything that would compare with the creation that is the gift given to women? And first things first, if they have talent, they can decorate the home or decorate the atmosphere of the home with music, for instance, or they can decorate the minds and the lives of their children and make a contribution so that what parent, what woman isn't more fulfilled by seeing a youngster, a child achieve than if she were to win the national something or other award for one of the visual arts or something.
You've just talked about women, and yet what man would not rather see his son be a good missionary than win the national something or other?
Well, you're making my point. There's no difference.
Is beauty in the eye of the beholder? You're a general authority, and so you'll carry weight within the church to say this is a beautiful thing for a temple. Is that just because you're a general authority, or do you think that there's more to that B word beauty than simply what we think it is?
The ancients had something, and they knew something about law, and law still in force. A law that is a law is irrevocable. The Lord said there are laws that are irrevocable. And the Pythagoreans had discovered mathematically the golden section. And it's simply the fact that you take a square and add a rectangle to the end of it of a certain proportion, and it has a beauty. You put 20 rectangles on a page and have one with that proportion, and ask people to pick out the one that pleases them most, one that they think might have some beauty. They'll always pick out that one. Why? There's something built into us, and going back to the patterns that they knew and that they understood that are still in force. I thought you might be interested in this, and that's the chambered nautilus. Uh-huh. And that mathematical equation that the Pythagoreans knew is right here. And that each one of these segments corresponds to a phase of the moon. And that this is a reproduction of the orbit of the planets. And it's all around us. And beauty, we're built that way.
You think we respond to it because It's part of that universal creation?
Beauty attracts and ugliness repels. Cleanliness, light attracts, filth repels. That's true. Our powers of smell will tell us that. Powers of sight. And there's some things we just cover our eyes because we don't want to see them. And I think I think we're all alike. Been around the world a bit to see people, and they produce different patterns and styles of art and architecture, but there's a similarity to them. You know, it's been said that classic architecture is frozen music. And it is, because you take the same mathematical patterns that govern music, and they govern architecture, they govern painting. And if we will give up and not try to pull down all of the barriers and throw away all the values and get rid of all the restraints and get an idea that if we're obedient that we can be inspired, then we will be inspired.
What would your message be to the membership of the church in general about the necessity or value of art?
Oh, my answer might surprise you, but the word simplicity comes to mind. Simple is very difficult to achieve. And it's an enough's enough. I know one of the great movie actresses that was on the Best Dressed Women every year. Someone asked her what her secret was. She said, well, when I get dressed for an occasion, she said, I always stop in the foyer as I go out, look in the mirror, and take off most of the jewelry. And then she'd put just the right bit, just the right. Doesn't take much. Doesn't take much on a square building to add just a little bit of cornice or something. It doesn't take much to follow the laws that the ancients knew about and studied and left for us if we don't tear them all down.
Tell me a closing remark, if there's something you'd like to kind of finish up with.
I hope with this Festival of Arts that they can see, first, that it's a continuation of what has been fostered before, that they can see what they have hold of, and that those in charge of it can manage it, so that it doesn't, a success can be very self-defeating. A real success almost inevitably is. And that if they can set some parameters and have enough is enough and do marvelously well and with great refinement what they do, and not let it go beyond its bounds, not let it change into something else, and not let it be corrupted, because it could easily be. That would be a tremendous contribution to the church, because then we could get the paintings we need for all of the temples, and there are going to be a lot of temples. We could have the music. We could have poems written that would be the lyrics for hymns. We could have all of the things that are lovely and praiseworthy and of good report, and we could all seek after them. When we think of temples, the word adorn comes to my mind. And adorn means to give luster to, as in quality. And if our temples are going to be adorned, they will be adorned because we have people who are creative. And members of the church, whether their talents or desires move into dance or music, architecture, painting, sculpture, any of it, and whether they want to move forward with a career or as an avocation, or to give service, or just to have it for their own personal pleasure. That's been encouraged from the very beginning. And if we keep the standards, then we have the right to inspiration. And if you follow the pattern, then we set a standard for the world. We will be blessed. Some years ago, President Kimball handed me these few lines. Enter this door as if the floor within were gold, and every wall of jewels, all of wealth untold, as if a choir in robes of fire were singing here. Nor shout, nor rush, but hush, for God is near. I would like to bear a witness that the gospel that we have in common is true. It's to cover all of our lives. So I wish you well, and you're pursuing your creative talents. He was a creator, and he lives. I know that he lives, and as we live according to his standards and are willing to hold them, then we will be blessed, and those of you with creative talents will bless the countless ones who enjoy what you are able to do. May the Lord bless you in the service that you render, because you can create.